Well, hey friends, welcome back to another installment of our study of cities of the biblical world. Sorry we missed last week. There was just enough other stuff going on that by the time I should have been posting the video, I had not really even been able to start doing the research and still had some other stuff I needed to tend to. So I went ahead and punted. This week is a little bit different. In fact, it's been kind of easy to do the research because I don't have to preach on Sunday. We got Dr. Helton coming in. So I don't have that responsibility and that time commitment for the week. So I am happy to be able to, sorry, I'm fiddling with my tea here. I'm happy to be able to sit that one out this week and do a little bit more work on this project instead. First week we looked at Rome, and the second week we took a look at Jerusalem. The third week we took a look at Corinth, and this week we're going to spend some time talking about Ephesus. Again, my intent is not for these videos to be especially long. I will try to be concise in my comments and give you the pertinent information. But Ephesus is a writing that the Ephesus is a city that plays an important role in the early church. The book of Acts contains a pretty good chunk of time that Paul spends in Ephesus and in conversation with church leaders from Ephesus. It also includes time that Apollos spends in Ephesus, and both some of what he taught and some of what he learned there, along with, oh goodness, I could have said it a second ago, and then I absolutely blanked on their names, Priscilla and Aquila, Paul's friends originally from Rome, who landed in Ephesus after Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome. So you have, a number of those converging voices that all find their way to Ephesus, and we'll talk about them in a minute. First, it's not necessarily surprising that they find their way to Ephesus. Again, after Rome and Alexandria and Corinth, but only occasionally, Ephesus is one of the most important cities in the empire, and it rivals Corinth for its place of prominence. Corinth is smaller in population, but second to none in wealth. Ephesus is a town of roughly 250,000 people in the first century. So it has a large population. Only Rome and Alexandria really are bigger as far as population goes. But Corinth's location on the little sliver of land between two oceans really helps, or two seas, really helps promote lots of goods flowing through, because it bypasses the dangerous journey around. Ephesus, however, is also an important place of trade. It serves as the western port to all of Asia Minor. Modern-day Turkey is that kind of maps. And Asia Minor in the Roman Empire was the most prosperous of all of the provinces. They had a large amount of goods, incredibly agriculturally rich land. There are 3 Roman trade routes that move out of Ephesus, one to the north, one to the east, and one to the south, which means all of the goods from Asia Minor making their way across the sea across the Mediterranean to Rome, to Greece, to Egypt, to anywhere that those trade goods go, they all have to go through Ephesus. And so, Ephesus, like Corinth, because of that trade, is extremely wealthy. And like Corinth, that wealth is consolidated in the hands of a very small percentage of those in town. Now, there are some major public works projects in Ephesus, places of extreme beauty. And even keeping the port open required regular tending and a lot of funding. In fact, there is no longer a port in Ephesus, not in the way there was in the first century, because as the maintenance and tending of that port, that mouth of where the river meets the sea went away, silt from the river and from the mountains began to build up, and now it's like a 8-mile trek from Ephesus to where the modern port city is, because boats can no longer make their way back up the mouth of the river the way that they were able to in the first century. Part of that is because boats have gotten a little bigger, but substantial issue with the silting of the river. Ephesus was the location of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the temple to Artemis, which, if you know the book of Acts, is an incredibly important kind of piece of the story of Paul's time in Acts, which we will get to in just a minute. But the temple was massive, and it was gorgeous, and it afforded Ephesus part of its prominence in the ancient world. And it was the type of place that people would travel to see, that they would come to Ephesus to pay their respects to Artemis if they were Greek. That's Diana if you're Roman, same goddess, different name as far as they were concerned. And so that is something that's important to the nature of the city as well. And because of their association with Artemis, and there's like, it was unusual at the time, but the city had an official contract with the goddess Artemis. Because of that, a lot of time and effort and energy went into the promotion of Artemis and the maintenance of the temple. There were still like 50 other temples, gods, goddesses that were worshipped in Ephesus, but Artemis took prominence. And part of the Artemis worship rites there in Ephesus was this emphasis on the mystical, on magic, and on sorcery, which also plays a role in the book of Acts. Again, one of those things that's important to know as you're reading your way through. And I think is one of the things that leads to this riot that takes place in Acts chapter 19. I'm trying to make sure I get all of the details first before we kind of start looking at textual connections. Oh, yeah. Don't know why. That's the first thing on my page. Not sure why I overlooked that. What makes Ephesus really interesting is that it was one of the places in the Roman Empire that was not legally speaking Roman. It maintained its status as a free city. It did not become a Roman colony or an imperial like station or anything like that. Now the Romans still obviously controlled, and the proconsul for Asia Minor was based out of Ephesus and all of those things. But because of how it came into the Roman Empire, which was by treaty, not by surrender or by war, it was essentially gifted to Rome on the death of the Mithridates. That they maintained some sense of Ephesian, of Ionian identity in a way that some other places were not able to, and they maintained some rights and some freedoms that other places in the ancient world don't have because of that free status. But that free status is also something that can be like dangled over them, like the sword of Damocles, where the Roman emperor can threaten to remove that status, or can treat them differently in dealing with them because they don't have that status. So you think about some of the perks that being a Roman citizen affords you, and some of the perks that being a Roman colony, which we talked about with Corinth, affords you. Those are absent for the city of Ephesus, even if many of the city members would have had Roman citizenship, the prominent ones. The city doesn't gain that status, doesn't have those protections. So, why does all of that matter? Well, Acts chapter 19 tells us the story of part of Paul's time in Ephesus. And several things happen that catch the attention of some prominent locals. The first thing that happens is that Paul is able to work some miracles that catch some people's attention. And you can read it yourself. I don't want to sit here and give you a blow-by-blow account of it. But in the end, what happens is that a number of people who, we get the idea, had already converted to Christianity but were still maintaining kind of a foot in the local customs and culture and in the magic, the sorcery that they'd been a part of for a while. They start burning their sorcery books, and they end up with a sorcery book bonfire that takes place. And word begins to spread about what has happened, because this is a rejection of local custom, and in some ways a rejection of Artemis. And for a city that's very proud of its temple and its goddess and its customs and its traditions, this is concerning. And especially since that sorcery, that magic, has its roots in the Artemis temple cults and practices. So there is a silversmith, a craftsman, whose name is Demetrius. He's tied to the temple cult in some form, whether that's making figurines or trading goods in the temple courts or just outside of the temple itself or whatever. But what he sees in Paul's actions and in the response of a few people to Paul's teachings is an implicit threat to Ephesus' goddess, to that relationship, to its status as a town, and that the slippery slope fear from Demetrius's end is if they all start to follow Paul and we lose this status, what happens to our business, what happens to our place in the world, what happens to our prominence, those are the fears. Now, a overzealous crowd responds to what happens with Paul, and he ends up being drugged to the theater. He doesn't end up being drugged to the theater. The crowd ends up dragging along some of Paul's companions to the theater. Paul is on the outside looking in of that part of the story. And in fact, some local officials who are friends of Paul beg him not to go and not to risk his life. It's another Christian and missionary friend of Paul's, Alexander, who ends up being shoved out there to speak. And they shout him down. For 2 hours, they chant the same thing essentially over and over. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. One, the theater that they drag him to is being excavated, or has been excavated at this point. It seats about 24,000 people, which is massive. Then and now, that's a very large space. And two, what really interests me in this story is when the mayor finally is able to interrupt the crowd, his biggest concern, and one that if you don't necessarily know the status of Ephesus and their role in the world and their place in the Roman Empire and that whole free city, not colony thing, he immediately says, "You've done this the wrong way. There are other ways to have these charges heard and dealt with. I'm concerned we're going to get charged with rioting." One, your job as mayor of the city is to keep the peace. And if there's a riot, you failed. And if you failed, the Romans don't deal nicely with failure. So he very literally feels his head on the chopping block and he would like to live. But two, the Romans have a tradition of dealing harshly with cities that get out of control. And again, if you can threaten their status as a free city, if you can come in with an army and crush them, then you can continue to gain benefits from the city without having to give them the types of concessions that you've been giving them thus far. So there's incentive in some ways, depending on who the emperor is. And at this point, we think probably not a kind guy. Nero is very likely emperor whenever this takes place, depending on where you are on the timeline. That seems likely. So, not inclined to deal kindly with people. And the very real concern from this mayor is both for his own life and for the status and place of his city. What makes that funny is the very thing that Demetrius is concerned to protect, he also puts at risk because of how things play out. and how the crowd responds. Which is also why it ends with the simple phrase, and he dismissed them and they dispersed, because they all recognize that they're in trouble as well. Just by the nature of being who they are and where they are and when they are. Those are all kind of important things to pay attention to. Yeah. I don't know. Ephesus was one of those places in the ancient world that I would have been very interested to visit. You think of... if you think of Athens as like the philosophical center of Greece, Ephesus kind of has that place as far as a center of thought. Things that start in Ephesus travel outward through Asia Minor. Ephesus is actually a place where at the end of the 1st century, they establish the first, I think, official temple to the emperor. Not just a monument honoring the emperor, but an actual temple with the purpose of developing a system of worship of the living emperor for the first time. That was already something people on Asia Minor were inclined to do just because of their past background, but had been unwelcome in the Roman Empire up until this point. We could talk about the emperors and why this is a moment that it happens some other time, but suffice it to say that at the end of the 1st century, there was a guy on the throne who liked the idea of being worshipped. And so they asked for and received permission to develop, essentially, this temple and system of worship for the emperor god. And then, of course, that spreads throughout Asia Minor. By the time the book of Revelation is written, which is very likely somewhere around the year 110, plus or minus 10 years, somewhere between 100 and 120, seems likely. There are multiple imperial cults on Asia Minor, and all of that kind of starts at Ephesus. It is a place that highly reveres the emperor for any number of reasons, and that also is one of the reasons why they don't want to go against the emperor here, because that type of reverence had been there since before Paul starts his missionary journey that direction. All right, so I'm not sure which city we're going to talk about next. We could talk about Alexandria. It doesn't play an overly important role in our New Testament texts, but it is an incredibly important city in the Roman Empire and in the early church, if you look past the first generation. We also could take the time to talk about Philippi, which is another interesting city in the Roman world for any number of reasons. Or we may take the time, instead of focusing on a city, to talk about a region like the Judean Hill Country. The difference between urban and rural existed in the ancient world just like it does the modern world. So maybe it'll be that. I don't know which one to tell you right now, but we will have at it next week. Glad that you were able to join us. See you next time around.